Good evening. Thanks for being with us. This is the Douglas Hills Church of Christ. This is our weekly study on the Crucifixion as a historic event, which we do every Tuesday night at 7:30. Let's begin this evening with a word of prayer before we get started. Let us pray. Our God and Father in heaven, we are thankful, Father, for this day. Thankful, Father, for this opportunity to be together to study your word. Father, we in particular this evening, as we have been over the last several weeks and will continue to do over the next few months, are focused on the crucifixion of your Son. Father, we know what a centrally important event this is in the world, but also for us individually. We are so thankful for the life that he lived, the sacrifice that he was willing to make. And Father, we understand that it's not because of his sins, it's not because of his faults that he was placed on that cross, but it is for our sins and for our faults that he was placed on that cross. Father, we don't fully grasp the importance, although we try. We don't fully understand the depths of the significance, although we try, but we do know, Father, that we are to be grateful, and we do know that it is only through his sacrifice, that it is only through him that we have the hope of salvation. And it is through him that we approach your throne. It's in his name. Amen. All right. So let's do a brief review as we begin here this evening on what we discussed last week. If you missed last week's talk, last week's class, feel free to catch it on YouTube or Facebook. But last week we talked about the Second Temple period. We began the conversation about the Second Temple period. And really in these first few classes here, as we're treating the crucifixion as a historic event, what we're really doing is laying the groundwork. And some of these delve a little bit more directly into the history of the period. They're a little bit more historic in nature. But we're really trying to kind of immerse ourselves into the world of the first century and into the world that Jesus is not only born in, but in the world in which he ministers in and is ultimately crucified. Last week we began that conversation really trying to have the viewpoint of a first century Jew, and we spoke a great deal about the role that the temple played in the first century. Here are some of the key takeaways, and feel free to go back and watch that lecture if you missed it. But Judea in the first century is a hotbed of tension and division. This is so critically important for us to understand the factors and the circumstances that ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion, is all of these various tensions and points of division that are shaping daily life, shaping the way he approaches the crowd, shaping the way the crowds react to him, shaping the way the priest and the Sadducees and others are trying to maintain balance, shaping the way in which the Romans are trying to maintain control in the region. This is a really significant period of time in Jewish history, even before Jesus enters the fray. There's a lot going on, whether it's between Roman occupation or between conflicts of class, etc. And those are some of the other takeaways that we discussed last week. The temple, which is the single binding force, if you will, for Judaism, is a place that is wholly Jewish and so uniquely Jewish. Jerusalem at this time is really a mix of a bunch of different nationalities, a bunch of different ethnicities. But the temple itself, especially when you get beyond the court of the Gentiles, that inner temple area inside the wall where sacrifices take place, are really the only place on earth, if you will, that is wholly and completely Jewish. And that makes it so important. But that also means that the temple is a staging ground for different views. And that's part of the things that creates the friction and friction that ranges between people who are conservative and want to protect the wealth that they have or protect the system as it's constructed under Jewish rule, and radicals, people who want to see Jewish self-rule, people who want to see the Messiah to come. All of these things kind of come to a head inside of the temple. Roman occupation is a central conflict of life. To understand Jews in this period, to understand what it's like to be Jewish in this period, is to understand the mindset of a conquered people. This plays a huge and important role in the daily life of Jews, as does class division. That these define life, from the priests and the Sadducees, who are the top, the aristocracy, who are far removed from the life of the common Jew. One of the things we talked about last week is this contrast between life in Jerusalem and life in the temple and life in Nazareth, where Jesus would have grown up. feel free to go back and watch that lecture. Tonight we're going to talk about another one of these central factors, one of these puzzle pieces, if you will, that contribute to the world in which Jesus is born and the world in which Jesus begins his ministry. On the picture there is Alexander the Great on the back of his horse Bucephalus, his great horse, who was with him throughout his entire conquest, lived the entire period, died not long after, actually outlived him, died not long after. And this tonight is titled One Humanity. And we're going to talk about the role that Hellenization plays not only in the world that Alexander leaves behind, but all the way up until the world that Jesus is born in, that Jesus is ministering in. This is going to be one of the central themes and central factors that shape the culture, that shape religious life, that shape every aspect of life in so many ways, but that becomes one of those central and critical points of tension for those who live in the first century. So, join me as we begin here in Daniel chapter 8. We'll read just a few verses here as we begin. Daniel chapter 8, I'm going to read from the English Standard Version. I'm going to start in verse 5. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Skip down to verse 20, where we get the interpretation of and the meaning of this. Daniel chapter 8, verse 20. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these were the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressions have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. We know, of course, that Daniel chapter 8 is talking about the man that's on the screen there, Alexander the Great. And the way in which this is laid out perfectly lays out exactly what happened during the period. The period of Persia, Alexander conquers the Persian, replaces the Persian Empire, and then, of course, his own reign will eventually be replaced by his 4 generals, through which his empire is divided. Alexander brought a sea change to the eastern Mediterranean and the extension of a civilization that has shaped every worthwhile civilization since. His military prowess is unmatched in history, with techniques that are still the source of study everywhere from West Point to the caves of the Middle East. He was outnumbered in every single battle he fought, and through sheer leadership, ingenuity, and courage, he prevailed every single time, conquering the entire known world. But to only know Alexander as a conqueror narrows his importance and misses his significance, especially as we think as to how that significance shapes the world eventually that Jesus is to live in. Alexander is no philosopher, despite having the greatest tutor of all time, the philosopher Aristotle, but he did bring with him a vision to the East, and to the Eastern Mediterranean. His vision, the one humanity policy, set to unify the entire world. Now, if history is to be understood as a series of revolutions and counter-revolutions, which is a process of reading history that I encourage you to adopt, there is no greater source of revolution and counter-revolution, perhaps in the history of the West, than Hellenization. In almost every way, in the 3rd century BC, the Greeks and Alexander and the civilization that he represents and is bringing with him as he moves across the known world is centuries ahead of every other civilization in the Mediterranean. Arguably centuries ahead of every civilization in the world. There are very few civilizations at the time who could rival the technological advancement, the art, just every aspect of Greek society is centuries ahead of anyone else. This is a civilization so advanced that it pulls the rest of the world to it, and the rest of the world is built on top of it afterwards. This country included. There's a reason when you go to Washington, D.C., all those beautiful buildings are built in the Greek revival form. It is America's claim to say that we're the inheritors of the Greek legacy. Every civilization since is built in some way, at least in the Western world, on Greek achievement, and in the Middle East as well in so many ways. Here's one of the many things that made the Greeks different, though. Unlike many of the great conquering empires that came before them, Greece was not, and Alexander did not merely want you to retain your standard of living and pay taxes back to them or pay tribute back to them. This may have been the way that many other empires did business, but it was not the vision that Alexander brought with him to the east. Alexander and the Greeks wanted to take all of the conquered peoples with all of their diverse languages and customs and sort of place a Greek layer over the top of them, unite them under the banner of Greek language and of customs. This is a wholly unique thing, far different than the way the Persians operated, far different than the way the Babylonians operated, far different than the way the Romans would operate after them. Understand first exactly what this means to take a layer, if you will, of Greek civilization and place it sort of over the top, blanket the existing civilization over the top of it. It's critical that the upper classes learn to speak Greek. Alexander and this sort of Hellenization attempt, this attempt at one humanity, is not really aimed at the lower classes. Is it necessary that they learn to speak Greek? No. Is it necessary that they learn the ins and outs of Greek rhetoric or of Greek pottery? No, not really. This isn't the focus. And in this way, there's a commonplace between empires that came before. In the same way that the Persians carried off really only the elites, the Greeks are largely focused on a transformation among the elites as well. This is an effort that targets those groups, and this begins at the time of Alexander's life by establishing Greek cities. This is a really important part of how this sort of this process of assimilation, although it's not exactly assimilation in the Babylonian sense of the word, how this process takes place is the establishment of Greek cities, which becomes so essential to understanding the structure of the Greco world and how the Jewish world and the Greek world interact with each other. To do this with the Greek cities, what Alexander would do is, as his army moved from one place to another, the veterans of the army, perhaps those individuals, and remember, they're marching for 15 years. This is ultimately one of the things that becomes the problem and what forces them to stop is that 15 years of battle is a long, long time, especially when you're moving constantly all across the Mediterranean and as far east as India. As the veterans would begin aging out of service, one of the things that Alexander would do in a conquered land would be to give those veterans a plot of land where they could go and establish a Greek city. Okay? And so this is the way in which this attempted Hellenization and this attempt to unify humanity under a blanket of Greek culture is done, is by placing Greek cities and Greek city-states that are to mirror the Greek city-states of Greece, the Athens, the Spartas of the world, that are to mirror them in nature in places like Syria, or in places like Egypt, or in places like India, to take the veterans of military conflict, give them that land with the expectation that they're setting up a Greek city in those places. Here on the screen is just a map of the full length of conquest. And you can see there towards the center that Tyre, Gaza, that area, and how Alexander comes through that area. Importantly, after he conquers the Persians on his way moving down to Egypt. We'll talk about that in a few moments. So Judea, as is evident always and evident in this picture, is not a major field of conquest for Alexander's army. Just as this will always be the case, we've mentioned this before as it relates to Rome, we'll mention this again as it relates to Rome. This is an area that's really in the crossroads, in between two places, in between Syria to the north and Egypt to the southwest. After defeating the Persians, Alexander took control of Judea on his way to Egypt, as you can see shown there. And that meant that that there were established Greek cities in the region, and the extension of his one humanity vision covered even Judea and covered the area where the Jews lived. Now, establishing a city, what we're talking about here is kind of being the prime mechanism of the spread of this philosophy or this vision. Doesn't mean building a place where thousands upon thousands of people live. It's not a city in that regard, and that's not exactly what it was to achieve. It usually meant about 1,000 people or so. Smaller city-states were always kind of characteristic of the Greeks, but it usually meant about 1,000 people or so. However, that's not including all of the rural areas and farmland that becomes dependent on that particular city and that particular location. But what made the city so important was not the scale or size of it. It was not the number of people who lived in it. What made it important is the collection of institutions that are inside of it and the role that those institutions would play in shaping the culture, the art, the religion, the philosophy, etc., of the region where they were. The center of a Greek city housed vital cultural institutions and one that contributed to the spread of Hellenization in whatever region the city was established. The farmland and rural area that surrounded it was dependent on it for selling and exchanging goods. As you might imagine, these cities became centers of commerce. And that, of course, helped them branch out and extend that cultural impact beyond the people in the city itself. Even if the rural, less educated, common people were not the target, this influence of Hellenization still spread through this. Education is always the key to cultural unification, and this is no different in relation to the spread of Hellenism. Wealthy families sent their son to be educated as a necessary prerequisite, and sons is important. There are some wealthy families who can afford to send women to be educated, but overall the focus of the Greeks, as is kind of the case always in this region and in this period, is that the focus of education is on men. Now, the Romans are a little bit different about that because in Rome, women can be citizens, but that's not the case in Greece necessarily. But so mostly what we have are institutions which educate sons and educate men. Education meant learning the Greek language, perhaps even learning music, perhaps learning Greek military techniques, certainly learning Greek poetry and Greek literature, and even things like pottery would be taught. So almost every aspect of education is Hellenized for these upper classes. This learning took place at the Greek gymnasium, which is a word that you might recognize. We still use it, but only with a limited part of its meaning, gymnasium. The gymnasium was the center of the city, a place where learning took place, where sports took place, where really life took place, where people would come together for all sorts of various interactions. And again, this largely focused on men, but not exclusively focused on men, but did exclusively focus on the upper classes. So to the extent that this sort of cultural shift is occurring, it is occurring among the upper classes. And now part of this assimilation and this Hellenization is intermarriage. This was a major part of Hellenization in every region that the Greeks controlled, was intermarrying among the people. Something that's important to understand, just the extent that Greek life infiltrated the life of wherever was the conquered region of the time. So this map here gives us an idea of the breakdown. This is right after Alexander died. We'll touch on that here in just a moment. There are 1,000 ways that this practice, this Hellenization practice, ultimately impacted Jewish life. Most of which there are books written on this subject. This is such a dominant factor in shaping Jewish life and shaping Christianity in the early centuries of Christianity. There are books written on this subject. Our focus is, of course, how this contributes and leads directly into the world that Jesus was born into, and really the tensions that exist in Judea in the first century. Now, understand, though, that Hellenization does not cease its attempt at unification, at a unified language or at styles of rhetorics or the adoption of Greek pottery in the major cities of the Mediterranean. An equally important aspect of one humanity was religious syncretism, or mixing together, which is just what the word syncretism really means. When Alexander and his army would conquer a new land, they didn't impose their religion upon conquered foes like the Babylonians had, nor did they merely leave the people to operate of their own volition the way the Persians had. The Greeks saw religion as a collection of many different gods. It's important to understand this philosophy. They're the ultimate polytheists, the Greeks are. So polytheistic that if they conquer your civilization and they realize that you have a god that they didn't, they don't get too upset about it. They just absorb those gods into their own panoply of gods. They say, look, we've conquered Syria, and they had these gods that we didn't know about. So we just absorb them into our religious philosophy as well. If your gods were similar to their gods, it would be understood as the same person, or just the same god with the same purpose under a different name. So the Egyptian god Isis, when the Greeks conquer Egypt, the Egyptian god Isis, they say, well, that's similar to our Greek god Artemis, and so it's just the same person. We'll even make statues that look like our god Artemis and say that that's Isis. The Jewish god Yahweh, that's similar to Zeus, so we'll just merge these ideas together as one. This was the Greek approach. Anyone who even has an elementary understanding of the Old Testament knows that this may have worked as a unifying practice in Syria or Egypt, but it would not be accepted by the Jews. Religious syncretism becomes one of the most contentious parts of the anti-Hellenistic structure or struggle that will dominate Judea for the 3 centuries after Alexander's death. Now, Alexander died at the age of 33, and his empire was divided into 4 parts, only 2 parts of which are really relevant for us. It's the Ptolemaic Empire, which is largely headquartered in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire there in Syria. Like always, as was the case whenever it was conquered, Judea is trapped between the two as a crossroads. The region changed hands. You can see there are the largest swaths of land there in the image between these two. And part of being that crossroads meant that it was sort of a battle point. It was where the 2 empires and the 2 kingdoms sort of met with one another to battle it out for control of this crossroads, not because they were particularly fond of Judea or particularly fond of the region or even particularly fond of the ports, but just because of its location as a central crossroads between those 2 very important civilizations. And so consider then how this positioning and the relative instability that caused. This region exchanged hands between these 2 kingdoms 5 different times during this period. Consider how that instability would have affected the region and would have affected the attitudes of the region and what it would have meant. First, it means that Hellenism is present in the region. It's heavily present, especially among the elites, and it shapes the culture and life of Jews. But Hellenism, though present, does not deeply take root in this area the same way it does in Egypt, with Alexandria being kind of the quintessential, the ultimate Greek city that's established. There's no city that becomes so significantly Hellenized and so identifiably Hellenized as Alexandria, or even in the way Damascus was during the period, largely because of this conflict and exchange back and forth that's constantly taking place. And so it's the system, Hellenization and Greek culture, is ever present, but not deeply rooted in the region. A prideful people are treated as a political football, making them eager for political independence. This constant turmoil, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It helps breed and foster an attitude of political independence, of the same sort of independent ideas that we see crop up over and over in this period and in this region, that this is a group of people who should control their own destiny, who should control their own nation state. Why is it that we're subject to these Hellenistic outside influences? When we're the chosen people of God, we should be leading ourselves. So, 4, the differences and distinctions between Jewish law. This is incredibly important. The differences and distinctions between Jewish law and Hellenism are heightened by the struggle and economic upheaval. Any region that is constantly changed in place like this, constantly the subject of battle and changes in leadership, That means economic upheaval as well. And economic upheaval is always a cause of instability, always sort of creates a longing, if you will, for stability and peace. And part of the way in which this conflict comes to a head is that this instability makes average common Jews and even sort of members of the middle class in Judea question how much Hellenistic law should be interfering with Jewish law, and how much Jewish law should retain its complete and total independence from any sort of Hellenistic influence in the law. This struggle is only heightened by this sort of back and forth nature. 5, the high priest and the upper class becomes far more central to the whole of society. Think about why this is, and this is really important as it sort of establishes over several centuries the role that the upper class and the high priest play. Because of the relative instability of who's in control, the flipping back and forth between the two kingdoms, it's really the high priest and the upper class that are sort of the token and the beacon, if you will, of Jewish leadership. This is the consistency, if you will, that exists in life amidst all of this inconsistency, trial, and struggle that's going on around. Okay? These are all important factors. This is to begin to understand how the world is shaped as we lead up to the time of Jesus. Now, in 201 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus took control of the region after 20 years of trying. He first tried to invade Jerusalem and invade Judea and take it from the Ptolemaic Empire in 222. Finally succeeds after 21 years of trying in 201 BC. And that shift, that sort of final shift, if you will, would have a dramatic impact on Jewish life as well. The Ptolemies governed Judea with a light touch. They were all the way down in Egypt, and they weren't quite as concerned about being heavy-handed against Jewish culture and institutions like the temple. They sort of let those things be. They did take tribute, they did take taxes, but it was very much a light touch and light-handedness in which they approached their own rule. The Seleucids do not share their open-mindedness, and this is especially true after Antiochus the Third, who's Antiochus the Great, as he's called, dies. Now, he did have a more light-handed approach to the Jews as they had come to expect, because most of the Jewish leadership had sided with the Seleucids in the battle in which he ultimately took the region. His son, however, Antiochus Epiphanes, who sat on the Seleucid throne beginning in 175 BC, does not share his father's light-handed approach to Jewish culture. Jews in this period are not uniformly opposed to Hellenization or to the merger of Jewish law and Hellenistic law, which is something that we should always remember, as we've focused on many times throughout of our conversations so far. We should always understand that there is a deep diversity in Jewish thought. It's important that we always remember that these events are being undertaken by real people with various motivations themselves, various interests, various backgrounds, various hopes and wishes. There are serious communities of Hellenized Jews that support the merger of these traditions in some ways that are totally antithetical to the law. This issue of autonomy versus assimilation begins in force during this period and is going to be a central part of Jewish life until the diaspora that follows the destruction of the temple, largely because of some of these divisions that begin about how to approach these questions during this period. Antiochus Epiphanes is an important player in this tension because he works to elevate the Hellenized Jews. He disrespects the Jewish tradition entirely. And perhaps there are some stories that he goes as far as to sacrifice a pig in the temple and gives rise ultimately to revolt. And that revolt, the Maccabean revolt, deals directly with Hellenistic influence and creates a period of Jewish independence. Antiochus Epiphanes sought to force Hellenization on all of the Jews. Again, one of the things that causes this tension that eventually leads to the Maccabean revolt is this attempt to force Hellenization on the Jews as a whole. He sought to eliminate the majority of Jewish laws, something that's held obviously close in Jewish identity, but helps, of course, move people who may have been moderate on this question in opposition to him, and to reduce the importance of the temple. Now, we're not going to do a full survey history on the period that follows the Maccabean Revolt, and we can summarize the importance of its impact nevertheless. This period after the Maccabean Revolt gives credibility to the long-held Jewish hope of self-rule, and it puts a focus on independence. It gives rise to messianic hope. The political culture and religious ideas that exist in the world that Jesus is born into are greatly shaped by the events that occur in that period and the world that the Greeks created. The question of mixing does not go away because of it, though. Just because there is an independent Jewish leadership that emerges following the Maccabean Revolt and a period of independent Jewish leadership, syncretism does not go away, and the questions of the role of Hellenization and how much this mixture should be occurring does not go away. It remains an important dividing question and an endless source of tension. In fact, the most important thing that happens between Antiochus Epiphanes and Herod the Great is that tension becomes institutionalized. Really important thing to understand that it really is what occurs in this period is an institutionalizing of tension. That's a picture there of Antiochus Epiphanes. I like it that he has his nose chopped off just because it makes him look all the more evil in that bust. Why the Maccabean Revolt matters. We will cover this very briefly. It provides a period of secure Jewish independence, a long-held and constant Jewish dream and hope, again, not uniformly, but certainly one that is an aspect of shaping life, if you will, for many Jews. It accelerates messianic hope, including messianic pretenders. We're going to talk about messianic pretenders in a few weeks and what it was that some of these individuals who claimed that they were the Messiah in the decades and centuries around the first century were really sort of pushing towards and what they were claiming to be. It exacerbates divisions over Hellenistic influence. It highlights and heightens the pre-existing class divisions, some of which we've touched on lightly last week in talking about the temple, some of which we've recognized and highlighted this week in showing the division that takes place between those who are educated in Greek, those who speak Greek, those who are part of the upper classes, and those who do not. And then, of course, it institutionalizes political factions, as mentioned. Now, against the threat of assimilation and the support of Jewish Maccabees revolts emerges the Pharisees. Now, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees emerged during this period in this institutionalization of tension that exists around Hellenization. But tonight I'm going to talk pretty much only about the Pharisees. We'll talk a little bit more about the Sadducees in a few weeks when we talk about the two-tier system. The Sadducees are, of course, the aristocracy. They're a much higher class in Jewish society in the first century, and they're really who controls the Sanhedrin at the time of Jesus' life. But against the threat of assimilation and these questions over Hellenization is how the Pharisees really emerge. The Pharisees are a separatist party. They're formed from the scribes and sages and believe in the purification of Judaism. This means religious purification and it means ethnic purification. Remember all of those ways in which I explained earlier that Hellenization sort of played a role in immersing itself into the culture and really getting into the home, if you will, of the civilizations in which the Greeks were a part of. The Pharisees very much believe in both a religious purification and an ethnic purification. They believed that the Jews were to observe the purity law, the same purity laws that are applied inside the temple everywhere they were. They're experts in the Jewish law, and they believe in the supremacy of Jewish law. They do not believe in the merger of Jewish law with Hellenistic law or with any other form of law. They believe that the Jewish law is supreme, that it comes from God and that it's supreme. Sometimes to their own detriment, they're committed to Jewish law. The Pharisees are not common people, but they're generally accepted by common people. They're a little bit more acceptable to the average Jew of the era, if you will, than the Sadducees, whose life really is so far removed and whose wealth is so far removed from the average life of a common person in the period, that the common people are not serious fans of the Sadducees. But the Pharisees do have a higher rate of acceptance. Now, they're not common people, and not every common person is a Pharisee. By about the first century, Josephus estimates, who is a Pharisee himself, estimates that there's somewhere around 6,000 Pharisees that exist in the land. And so, it's a fairly large sect. It's one of 24 different sects, but the two largest in the region, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, it's one of the larger ones and one of the ones that is sort of more commonly accepted. Politically, they're really quite an interesting group, and it's an interesting movement. They're really loyal to the law rather than any family or any empire. Loyal to the law to a fault, as I mentioned, something that is repeatedly evident about them. But they're not as corruptible as their rival upper-class Sadducees. In fact, they aren't even loyal to the Hosmanian dynasty, the dynasty that emerges after the Maccabean period. They're not even loyal to it. Like most political parties, their hatred for their political opponent, the Sadducees, in some ways blinds them from the bigger picture. It is the Pharisees who eventually asked the Romans to intervene and end the dynasty to restore the old priesthood, and even open the gates actually to Jerusalem to let the Romans in. Of course, they're willing to put their hatred aside on one very important occasion, when at least for a few hours, a few days before the Passover feast, their interest with the Sadducees aligned to murder a Jewish rabbi from Galilee. Before we close, let me provide just a review of the traceable effects, even beyond this institutionalized tension and institutionalized sort of party apparatus, if you will, on the effects of Hellenization and how it ultimately leads to the event of our focus. Here are some of the tangible ways that Hellenization, whether it's through the Pharisees themselves or whether it's through the Sadducees themselves or the various parties, or etc., ultimately created the environment and circumstances of Jesus' death. First, it exacerbated class differences. This Hellenization period, exacerbated class differences through adoption of Greek language and customs by upper classes. Two, it established Greek cities and institutions throughout Judea and the region. I say here it's a fly in the ointment that these Greek cities, like I mentioned, they aren't necessarily a lot of people, but in some ways they stick out like a sore thumb among a region or among a people who are eager for self-rule. And they're a fly in the ointment, if you will. Number three, they created instability. Hellenization creates instability as a crossroads between rival empires, something that we already made reference to and talked about the way in which this doesn't allow Hellenization to take deep root, but has it as this sort of ever-present aspect of life. Four, it encouraged the adoption of religious syncretism that undermined Jewish law and the worship of the one true God. This religious syncretism is never something that the Jews are okay with. Remember, this is a people who is largely and entirely unified by religion. They are not unified even, I would argue, by a specific region. They are not even they're not even unified behind a single sort of philosophical tradition or any sort of worldly philosophical tradition. They're not unified behind a single monarchy or anything like this. What ultimately unifies the Jewish people is their own religion, and especially as a central aspect of that, their monotheism, their belief in the one true God, and being the chosen people of that one true God. You can only begin then to imagine how a civilization like the Greeks, which practiced the ultimate polytheism, would have conflicted with this. Number five, it led to revolt and the hope of independent Jewish rule. Six, it developed a robust messianic hope, something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a few weeks, but is extremely important to the environment and circumstances that lead to Jesus' death. 7, finally, it established rival political parties that would shape Jewish life at the time of Christ. That's really important, those institutionalized parties. And though the Sadducees and Pharisees that emerged from the same period and are divided initially, if you will, based on their reaction in some ways to Hellenistic influence, of course, that would not be the only thing that became the differentiating factors between them. And again, in a few weeks, whenever we talk about the two-tiered system of Roman government, we will discuss all of kind of those aspects that ultimately identified and characterized those two parties, which hated one another, but were able to come together for a unified hatred of Jesus and at least a willingness on one night to work together to crucify him. So, this is an overview of how Hellenization plays a role in the world of the first century. Now, I know that this is a little bit more of a historically focused talk. It kind of dives deeply or somewhat into the historic nature of the period, but these first few lectures, these first few classes here are really important for us as we begin to assemble these puzzle pieces that will ultimately help us understand the world as it exists and all of these various factors that sort of come together in the first century and come together at the time of Jesus' life that create the circumstances for his crucifixion. Next week, we're going to pick up with a conversation about a man who brings together so many of these various disparate influences and for at least a period is able to unify them all under one roof, and that's Herod, who's able to take the Roman influence, to take Hellenized influence, to take kind of Jewish identity, and either by force or by charisma or by whatever factor, he's able to at least temporarily unify that. And then, of course, his death creates just a whole new set of problems that in some ways brings these things to a head in an even larger way. Now, before we close overall on this talk about the role of the Greeks, and we talk about the role of Hellenization specifically, and as I mentioned, you can study for a long time and in many books over the role in which Hellenization plays overall in the early church. Even in this period, there's so much more left to be said, but this gives us a sort of a focused view of the way in which some of these factors play into the circumstances and environment that lead to Jesus' death. And before we close this evening, there's at least one more important contribution that the Greeks made, and it stretches back to the conquest of Alexander himself. After the primary army of the Persians had fallen, only one important, well-defended city under Persian rule and under Persian allegiance remained, Tyre, depicted right there. Tyre was a heavily fortified city with the main part of the city surrounded by water and tall walls. There's an older part of the city that's further inland, not heavily defended, but the heavily part of the city is depicted right there, surrounded by water and tall walls. The Babylonians had attempted to take the city themselves with a siege that lasted 13 years. 13 years, as strong as the Babylonians were. 13 years they put that city under siege without it ever falling. A feat even more impressive than Leningrad. They were confident, as you might imagine, the people of Tyre, against the Greek army as well. Alexander gave them the opportunity to surrender. He had already conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire with the exception of this incredibly important, well-fortified city. They were the only thing left, and his offer for surrender was turned down. Now, for Alexander, this was the kind of challenge that he loved, a conquest that the Babylonians had tried so hard and failed at, the last little remaining hamlet in the Persian Empire to be taken down. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that Alexander lived for. He began his siege by first attempting to build a bridge that his army could cross. You can see that little stretch of land that, especially during a period when the water was low, would be easy to move across there. He begins by trying to build a bridge there that the army could cross. But this becomes expensive and very difficult. As the builders get closer, they're easier to kill there from inside of the walls. They're easier to fire upon. And it becomes very expensive and very troubling to build as they get closer and closer there. It becomes clear to Alexander that the only way to take the city would be through naval power. So he rowed back north to find ships to bring under his command, eventually gaining the loyalty of literally hundreds of ships, 250 plus ships that he brought under his command. With this new naval power, he took the city. He decimated the army that had refused to surrender to him. To make his dominance especially clear after his robust victory was complete and after the fall of the city, he took 2,000 enemy soldiers to the beaches of Tyre. Rather than kill them easily and quickly, he decided to use a form of execution that he had learned from the Persians, the fallen empire that the people of Tyre had retained their allegiance to. And it was there on the beaches of Tyre, perhaps never done before by a Western power, but eventually adored by the powerful Roman Empire, that Alexander introduced Europe to crucifixion. Insomuch as that he had altered the Mediterranean world through conquest, how was he to know, standing there before 2,000 crosses, 2,000 crucified soldiers of Tyre on the beaches, enjoying the spoils of a great military victory, that he had just played a small part in the most important event 300 years later on a hill outside distant Jerusalem, where one cross would forever change the world. See you next week.